I think we can bring the jury in.
Yes, Judge.
Okay, please be seated. Next witness.
The defense would call Shannon Roberto.
Stand by the chair. Consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth under pains and penalties of perjury.
I do.
Please be seated. Pull your chair forward and speak into the microphone.
Thank you.
Good morning. Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Shannon Roberto, Roberto.
And how are you employed?
I am a volunteer at St. Michael's Rescue.
And how long have you been a volunteer?
I've been a volunteer for 4 years now.
Okay. And so you're an EMT?
I'm currently an advanced EMT. At the time of the incident, I was an EMT.
Okay, thank you. So on October 8th, 2016, were you working that evening as an EMT?
Yes, I was.
And for who?
I was working for St. Michael's Rescue.
And did you respond to an accident that night?
We did.
About what time?
I'm not sure exactly what time, but I know it was nighttime.
And do you remember where you responded to?
We responded to the interstate.
And did you have any information about the accident prior to arriving?
From what I can remember, we did not have any information going to the accident.
And when you got to the scene, did you provide care to someone?
Yes, when we arrived on scene, we provided care to the patient, Stephen.
Okay, and so you came to learn the name of the person you were providing care to?
At some point we did. I don't remember at what point during the call.
And what was his name?
Stephen.
And what was he doing when you first saw him?
From what I can remember, when we first came upon the patient, he was in police custody on the ground.
And what did you do next?
We loaded him onto a backboard, so we just transferred him from the ground to a stretcher and then put him into the ambulance.
And in the ambulance, how are you positioned?
When I was, excuse me, when I was sitting, when I was in the ambulance, I was sitting near Stephen's head, so we have seats that are directly next to the stretcher, so I was sitting closest to his head.
And so once you got Mr. Burgoyne in the ambulance, what was your role?
My role at the time, as I was in the lowest position, so it's primarily just grabbing equipment and speaking to the patient.
And was he responsive?
The patient was in and out of responsiveness, so it varied throughout the call.
And do you remember if you had to do anything to see if you could get a response out of him?
Throughout the call, when he was awake, he would be talking, and then he would sort of go out of it, so he would close his eyes and appear to be unresponsive, so I would do a sternum rub to have him react, and then he would wake up.
And what is a sternum rub?
It's essentially a technique that you use. You rub the sternum vigorously to try to get a pain response from somebody, and from there you can tell whether they will respond to you or not. They usually will wake up.
And did Mr. Burgoyne respond easily to the sternum rub?
I don't recall, actually.
And did you previously give an interview on March 21st, 2018?
I believe so.
And would seeing a transcript of that interview refresh your recollection about whether Mr. Burgoyne responded easily to the sternum sternum rub?
Yes.
And I have what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit F. If I may approach.
Yes.
So, Mr. Roberto, I'm handing you a transcript of your interview. If you could turn to page 7, just read that to yourself.
Yes.
And does that refresh your recollection about whether he responded easily to the sternum rub?
Yes, it does. I had to do a sternum rub multiple times, so it was difficult. But then he would wake up, say a few words, and then he would go back to being unresponsive.
And did he seem aware of what was happening?
When he would be awake and talking, he was asking random phrases, like, where am I, where are we going, or take me to the hospital, things like that. So he seemed confused, but he was able to speak in phrases.
Okay. And when he was awake, was there anything that he said to you that you thought was odd?
When he was awake and talking to me, besides the phrases that I already said, he seemed to be confusing me for someone else. And he said things like, "Did you dye your hair?" or something about me having children. He said, like, "Do you have 2 kids?" Things like that. And I acknowledged that that was odd because I never met him prior to the incident.
So Mr. Burgoyne was acting like he knew you,
Mm-hmm.
and you had never met Mr. Burgoyne prior to the night of this accident.
That's correct.
And overall, how did Mr. Burgoyne seem to you?
Initially, when we first got to him, he seemed agitated, and that was when he was pretty awake. And then in the ambulance was when it was varying. He was asking odd questions or saying phrases that were not very consistent. So
I don't have any further questions, but the state might. Thank you.
Any cross?
Yes, just briefly, Your Honor.
Okay.
Good morning.
good morning.
Just a couple of questions for you. Based on the statements that Mr. Burgoyne said to you, it was your opinion that he thought you were somebody else, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And the statements were about dyeing your hair and having children, correct?
That's correct.
And so at least for the dyeing your hair, it was specifically about the way that you looked, correct?
That's correct.
And he never made any comments to you about your voice or recognizing your voice, did he?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. And you said that when he was initially more awake, he was agitated, correct? And
That's
can you
correct.
explain a little bit more about that?
When we were on scene, I remember getting there. I don't remember how we got there. Not how, but I remember interacting with him. He was on the ground, and I'm pretty sure he was yelling, and he was in handcuffs. And like I said, he seemed agitated.
Okay. And then once you were in the ambulance, he seemed like he was confused at times.
Yes.
And again, he thought that he might know you.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in and out of consciousness.
Yes.
And were you aware at the time that he was in the ambulance with you that he had just been involved in 2 major head-on collisions?
At the time of the crash, we knew he had been involved in at least one with the second vehicle. We had no idea about the first vehicle crash.
Okay.
in that crash.
Okay, so assuming that you knew about the second collision, the head-on collision, was his behavior in the ambulance to you, did that seem uncommon to you for somebody who had just been involved in a major collision?
No, that's pretty consistent for someone who would have been involved in a high mechanism crash.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Any redirect?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
You're all set, thank you.
Thank you.
Call Alan Kosovic, Your Honor.
Morning.
Stand by the chair. Face me and raise your right hand. You solemnly affirm the evidence you shall give relative to the cause now under consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth under pains and penalties of perjury.
Yes.
Please be seated. Pull your seat forward. Speak into the microphone.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Please state your name and spell your first and last name.
Alan Kosovic, first name A-L-E-N, last name C-O-S-A-B-I-C,
Okay, and where do you live, Mr. Kosovic?
Williston, Vermont.
And are you employed?
Yes,
How are you employed?
I work for FEMA.
And do you know Stephen Burgoyne?
Yes,
How long have you known him?
I believe since 2008, roughly April.
And so you've known him from 2008 until, well, you knew him up until 2016, correct?
Correct.
And so what was your relationship with Mr. Burgoyne?
We worked at Logic Supply. That's how we met, in the shipping department. And then the friendship grew from there.
And so would you describe yourself as acquaintances or good friends? Or?
Good friends.
And was there ever a time that Mr. Burgoyne actually lived with you?
Yes,
Okay, and who else? Who
just him.
Okay, no, who would he live with? Who would be in your residence?
Oh, sorry, my wife and 2 kids.
And when was that he lived with you?
I believe after he came back from Massachusetts. I'm sorry, I don't recall the year.
So Mr. Burgoyne had been down in Massachusetts for a period of time, and he moved back, and that's when he lived with you?
Correct.
During that period of time, where was Anila? You know Anila Lawrence?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, and when Mr. Burgoyne was living with you, where was she living?
I believe she was with her parents in Colchester.
And so could you just describe Mr. Burgoyne's personality? Was it the same from when you first met him until 2016, or not? Well, first describe it, and if it was different at different times, let us know.
I mean, I guess after he came back from Massachusetts and with all of the financial situations and everything, he was more stressed out.
How was he before that? Actually, how was he at Logic Supply back in the day?
I mean, normal. I don't know. I'm not sure how to really explain it.
Would you do things socially with him back when you guys worked together at Logic Supply?
Yeah, just like, we would go out for dinner and hang out and just a regular person.
And then when he came back and he was more stressed out.
Correct. He has marital issues, financial issues.
How did that manifested with Mr. Burgoyne, and what did you see in him?
I guess just stress. I don't know how else to describe it, honestly.
And you and he would discuss these issues?
Yes. Just, I guess, everyday problems.
And did you ever speak with him? Were you aware at some point that his grandmother died?
Yes.
And was he close to his grandmother?
Yes.
And did that take him How
That
did that affect
was
Mr. Burgoyne?
pretty much his second mother.
How did that affect Mr. Burgoyne that you noticed?
Very much. After I can't recall if I think father died after that as well, or was it before? It was close, within same year, I think.
And you talked about Mr. Burgoyne talking about financial stresses with you.
Yes.
Was there anything about the passing of his grandmother that was related to financial stresses? In other words, was that going to do anything with regard to his finances that his grandmother passed?
I know he was getting some kind of inheritance, but I can't recall that we've discussed the amount or anything like that, honestly.
Did Mr. Burgoyne ever accuse you of kind of going behind his back and talking to coworkers about you?
I think once.
And had you done that?
No.
How did that make you feel?
I was a little mad.
Because that was just something that...
Well, yeah, there was... he was stating that there were some issues. We used to work at Lake Champlain Chocolates together, too, and he was stating that there were issues with the employees there, and everyone knew that we were friends, so I've never witnessed those issues, or they've never said anything in front of me, so...
But Mr. Burgoyne accused you of saying things behind his back to those employees?
Yes, once, yes.
And you never did that?
No.
The week prior to the accident in October of 2016, did you see Mr. Burgoyne that week?
Yes.
And how did he appear to you during that week?
Same, stressed out, financial issues, problems with Anila.
Okay. Was it more or less stressed out than he usually was?
I would say more, a little more.
And how did that manifest himself other than just what he was talking? Did it manifest in how he acted at all?
I mean, when he would come, he would pace around the house while talking, things like that.
Were you aware that the Saturday before the accident that Mr. Burgoyne had a visit with his daughter at gymnastics?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. You were aware that he had not seen his daughter for some period of time?
Yes. Well, he saw her week prior to that once. Same thing on gymnastics, but yes.
Okay. And did he? Were you aware that he was going to have an upcoming visit?
Yes.
Okay. And how did Mr. Burgoyne appear to you with regard to that upcoming visit?
I think that was hurting him the most, honestly, the lack of visitations.
Okay. But how about the fact that he had an upcoming visit?
It seemed like, well, I don't want to say he didn't care, but it was he was focusing more on financial issues and problems, what was going on at the house, rather looking at the positive thing of seeing a daughter, I guess.
Or you just have a moment now. Did you see Mr. Burgoyne on the Friday before the accident?
Yes.
And where and when did you see him there?
We went to Five Guys for lunch.
Okay, how was it? I mean, where were you? What time? Do you remember the details of it?
Vaguely, I think I was at the house at the time getting ready to go to North Carolina. There's been a hurricane went through there, and I was going down with work for relief efforts. And he called me, I believe, and told me that he quit his job and just wanted to kind of talk, and we went for lunch there.
And what was the discussion about?
Same thing. He was, financial issues, problems at the house, kind of discussing if we made a mistake for just walking outside of the job type of thing.
And how did Mr. Burgoyne appear to you during that lunch?
Same, I guess, as he was for past, I don't know, couple of months.
And then how long were you together at lunchtime?
if I had to guess, maybe an hour, but that's just a rough estimate. I
And
can't
then-
recall exactly the
Okay.
time.
And then did you see him again after that? When did you see Mr. Burgoyne next after that?
Yeah, he showed up at our house, which is, I believe, was technically after midnight, so it would be Saturday morning, about 4 a.m., something like that.
Okay. And was that, did he usually stop by at 4 a.m.?
No,
Okay, so was that odd?
it was a little odd. I mean, he did live with us, so he knew he could stop by, but yeah, he's never done it before.
But were you awake and hanging out, or what was going on at 4
No,
o'clock?
I think I just went to bed. My wife and kids were asleep, and I heard dogs barking, and he rang a bell, so I got up and opened the door.
And, did Mr. Burgoyne and you have a conversation? I mean, did he tell you why he was there at 4 o'clock in the morning?
He kind of chuckled a little bit and said, he asked if Vanilla was there, and he said that he got a text from her or something like that, and I let him in, and he kind of paced around the house. We talked a little bit again about the marital problems. He used the restroom and left.
Okay. And during that period of time, did you notice whether Mr. Burgoyne had his phone or not?
I believe he did have a phone.
Okay. Did you see him actually using it?
As I remember, when I opened the door, I saw a phone, and the light was on at the door.
And did Mr. Burgoyne seem angry to you?
No, I wouldn't say angry. I would say stressed out.
Okay. And did Mr. Burgoyne ever talk to you about suicide?
No,
Okay. Was he ever violent?
no, not in front of me or my kids.
Did he ever talk about killing people?
No.
If I can just have a moment, Your Honor. If I can just have a moment, Judge.
Sure.
We talked earlier about how Mr. Burgoyne felt about the upcoming visit with his daughter. Do you remember about that?
Yes.
And do you remember doing an interview back in October of 2016 with a couple of police officers after this incident?
Yes.
Okay. And do you remember telling them that Mr. Burgoyne was happy about the visit and the upcoming visit?
I believe that's what I stated. Yes, I believe that was at the house when he came that night. I kind of mentioned to him that, he's seeing the daughter tomorrow, and, there's a positive thing to look at. And
Right. And he seemed happy about that.
yes.
I'm sorry, I thought I got you wrong on direct, but...
Yeah, I haven't read the affidavit, so just sorry.
I don't have anything else, Judge. Thank you.
Cross.
Good morning, Mr. Cross.
Good morning.
So you told us that you and the defendant were pretty close friends, right?
Yes.
And he would talk to you about personal issues, at least throughout 2016, is that right?
Correct.
And he talked to you about his relationship with Anila,
Yes.
and he would complain about her, right?
Yes.
He wanted to leave her, but he felt he was stuck with her because they had a child together.
That's a tough one. He felt like he was stuck with her. To back up, I only heard one side of the story. I just want to state that, but
And that was his side?
yes. He was feeling like he's stuck with her because of financial, or I guess she was threatening him to take a child away if he wouldn't provide the money for her.
Okay. And he was frustrated that she didn't work enough,
Correct.
and that stressed him out, right?
Yes.
Okay, and he would, as you told us, he complained a lot about his financial problems?
Yes.
And again, that stressed him out, right?
Yes.
Okay. And in the weeks prior to October 8, 2016, did he continue to talk about those stresses with
Yes.
you? Okay. And he continued to talk about his relationship with Anila to you?
Yes, or lack of.
Okay. You were aware that he was charged with domestic assault and unlawful restraint here in Vermont, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And as part of his conditions of release, any guns that he had in his home had to be removed.
Correct.
All right. And do you remember what those guns were?
AR-15, I think, and pistol.
And you took possession of those guns so that he could comply with the court order?
Correct, per judge's orders. Yes, I agreed to it.
So you had dinner with the defendant, you and your family, at Al's French Fries back on October 6th, which would have been the Thursday before the...
Yeah, I can vaguely remember, yeah.
You didn't notice anything different about him at that dinner, did you?
Just, again, stressing out and...
All right, and you told us about on October 7th, that Friday, that you had lunch with him at Five Guys, and he complained to you about being stressed out at work, right?
Correct.
About not having enough money,
Correct.
and that work was a stressful environment for him.
Yes.
And he didn't want to go back.
Yeah, well, when we went to Al's, he already quit it, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you remember suggesting to him, well, why don't you just go apply to McDonald's? The pay is the same and there wouldn't be any stress.
Yeah, I believe I did say something like that, yeah.
Okay. So, and do you know if he actually followed your suggestion and took your advice about McDonald's?
I don't know if he did or not.
Okay. And at that lunch, he complained about Anila, that she didn't want to work and she was taking advantage of him, didn't he?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So other than being stressed out about all of the things he was always stressed out about, did you notice anything unusual about him at that lunch other than that?
No, again, I mean, he's been so stressed out for such a long time that year, there was nothing more to it, I guess.
Okay. So you knew him when he worked at Logic Supply back in 2008?
Yes.
And the complaints that he was making to you about Lake Champlain chocolates were basically the same complaints that he had made about Logic Supply, isn't that right?
Not really.
Was he happy at Logic Supply?
He was with his first position, but after he took the second position, there was more work involved to it.
Okay. And he would complain about he was working too hard and nobody else was doing any work?
I mean, complain just like every coworker, we would talk about it. So yes, I guess.
And he left Logic Supply, right?
I left first, so I don't recall how long after me he left.
But he did leave?
Yes.
Okay.
Again, I don't know the details, if it was mutual leave or he quit. I don't know the details of that.
Okay. And you knew that he had also worked at Toyota, right?
Yes.
And he complained about his work at Toyota as well, isn't that right?
Correct.
Okay. So you told the jury that the next time you saw the defendant after the Five Guys lunch was on Saturday, October 8th in the early morning hours.
Correct.
And he showed up at your house. And when you opened up the door, he kind of chuckled and said, "Is Anila here?"
Yeah, kind of smile. I guess kind of an uncomfortable chuckle. The way I interpreted it, it was kind of like an uncomfortable chuckle that he was looking for an excuse to come that late. That's at least the way I viewed it.
So you interpreted his demeanor, at least at that point, was, well, he
He
felt
knew
us.
that he was late, I guess.
Okay.
Or again, that's the way I interpreted it.
And so you kind of laughed back and said, "Come on in, you don't need an excuse. You can
Yes,
visit." Okay. And he told you he couldn't sleep?
I believe so. I can't remember now the details.
You did tell us he was pacing back and forth
Yes.
in your house. And
Yeah.
he was worried that he had walked out on his job.
Correct.
Concerned him. And that Anila, he was complaining again about Anila, right?
Yes.
She didn't want to work. And that Anila had actually threatened to take his child.
Correct.
Okay. And he didn't know what to do.
Yes.
He didn't say anything about being on some sort of governmental mission, did he, to you that night?
No, I
That
don't
early
recall
morning?
it.
Or anything about the FBI?
No,
Or being under surveillance?
no.
Okay, and he stayed somewhere around 30 minutes and then left?
Something like that. Yeah, I used the restroom and left.
And you had actually invited him to stay over? if you
Yes, I
wanted to
did
stay
tell
over.
him if he wants, he can stay and sleep over.
Okay, thank you, that's all I have.
Yeah.
Just briefly, Rich. You're going to do it in 1 minute.
No, we can finish this witness.
Okay. And there would, back to that night at 4 in the morning, there was no reason why Anila would have been at your house, correct?
Correct, no.
And after he left, you actually texted him saying, wanted to make sure he was okay, correct?
Yes.
Nothing else, Jim?
Just in follow-up, when he showed up at your door, he said, is Anila here? He said, I got a text that she was here. Isn't that what he told you?
Yes.
He pointed to his phone.
Yes, he did point to the phone, yes.
Thank you.
All set?
Nothing else,
You can step down, thank you.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, it's a good time. All right, so we'll break for lunch, and we'll try to resume as close to 1 o'clock as possible. So I'm going to continue to encourage you, please, not to discuss the case with each other or do anything to learn anything more about the case. I'm not going to tell you to take a walk today for obvious reasons, but we'll have a good lunch and we'll see you back at 1 o'clock.
Rise, please.